Good afternoon. This is one more video on and about the conscientization. This one word I have gathered from Paulo Freire from Brazil, and it has been my focus in the past 15, 20 years. And so I think this particular year, when I have abstained myself for the first the 2 months, was preparing more sharing of the videos here, continuing the subject matter of conscience, and where I think part of this contribution by my personal study and analysis of the Chinese culture, reflecting also about in what I'm thinking about the Chinese civilization, where I have come to a good result, where I think in what I created the terms Consciencological Studies, meaning this can be opened up to all the more, and people can participate into this format of thinking, where I think since 1492, the Western expansion into the discovery of America, which I give tremendous amount of due credit to the Japanese, to the Portuguese and their exploration and their discovery of the Americas. But what comes afterwards, with all the merit of the spirit of exploration, and in my study and hunches about the early Portuguese wanting to move along the West African coast and into the Asia, which they know by the caravans of the Arabs and by the building of the ships, caravelas, in the use of compass, in the use of the Arabic, Judaic from the Andalusian part of a North African, and the measuring of the gauging with the tides, with the water. I'm not a maritime specialist, but I admire the Portuguese work where they have coasting along the way from their early colonization, which was not given due credit by Vatican when they found the Canary Islands. And because with that dispute between Portugal and Spain, the Pope had awarded the Spanish, and what is very interesting in all these bits and pieces in the way I'm presenting the Portuguese exploration, the Portuguese maritime discovery from the African coast, and then eventually further down south, discovering a part of at 1400s, mid 1400s, they already have found perhaps Brazil. All this coming to my research on the Portuguese dispute with a treaty called the Tordesillas. In Portuguese, we call it Tordesillas because the double L in Spanish is Tordesillas, in Portuguese, Tordesillas, where the Pope Alexander VI, but remember, Alexander VI, coming from the origin of Valencia, he is the Borgia of Borges from Spain, which when the King of Portugal have decided to dispute the divide at that time in what I call the Iberian global power, when the Pope using Tordesillas had divided up the part of the ocean in the middle of the Atlantic, gauged from the islands of Cabo Verde, to have the east, which is predominantly Portuguese, in Africa, and then to the west, when Columbus discovered in the segment of the Bahamas, Hispaniola, present-day Santo Domingos, and also the island we're hosting, Dominican Republic. And there's a lot of questioning and suspicions when we're talking about Columbus and his identity. He was never Italian. And this is based on my rationale and with more Portuguese books written about Columbus supposedly be of a illegitimate child between the Duke of Beja in the area Alentejo, and then his Jewish mistress from the family Zarco. The family Zarco is also one of the early converted Jews, we call it conversos, was another explorer who discovered the island of Madeira. So in the region, when all the studies with the written history about Columbus, he was of Portuguese origin. If not, he could have been raised in the region, the Madeira, which his languages he most used, the most commonly used, were Portuguese. His Spanish was sluggish, and his Italian was unknown. But maybe a little bit of me trying to be favoring of the for the world history when we are sharing, that we also be subjecting dispute and challenges. So whatever we present, the validity in what we present in the open society today with the use of AI and whatnot, every point can be challenged, which is good because you can challenge to find new discovery in the story I perceive about Columbus. Basically, what I'm trying to say, the full global discoverer of the world in Americas beyond Europe, they were all Portuguese. First, Columbus, his last name in Spanish, Colon, and the means a little a la column. You look at those dots. Look at those dots of the coat of arms. Has a lot of meaning to that. And there are more video about Columbus and his heritage from Portugal. And then he was born in the town called Cuba. It was the only town in the Roman name of Cuba, which Columbus had given the island of Cuba. And also look at all the names of the saints. It was the vicinity of the Cuba, Alentejo, Portugal, and many cities and municipalities were named after the saints. Okay, that shows his attachment or his linkage, his heritage to Cuba, Alentejo, Portugal, and so on and so forth. Let me repeat of the issues I am embracing warmly with the Portuguese discovery and the Portuguese school of the navigation, Henry Príncipe Infante, we call it in Sagres, in the region of Algarve, southernmost of Portugal. And King John, his son Enrique, was created one of the most dynamic navigation school, and gathering all his resources, again, into the forming of the Portuguese nation. The Portuguese were formed by a great deal of a tolerance. Portugal was the last one to have expedited the Inquisition in Spain in that time. So the tolerance of the ethnic Jewish population, the Arabic, then you have the Arabe, Mozarabe, and the conversos, which is with the new Christians, Jewish converting to the Roman Catholic faith. But in that tolerance, also Portugal was very much embraced the Knights Templars. This is another offside, but it's a story that in the Crusades, the most eloquent, the most disciplined, and the most self-sustaining, that efficiency, economic efficiency of the Templar Knights, 50% or more were monastic, were monks. The reason they got dissolved is because the king of France at that time had tremendous amount of debt by the banking credit created by the Knights Templar, so they were eventually removed. But when they exiting, Portugal had also tolerated and welcome the Templars' engagement. Another symbolism you can see in the big cross. If you look at the Portuguese ships with a big red cross, but inside of them is the white cross. The big red cross is representing, at that time, the Portuguese created Ordem de Cristo, the order of Christ. That is that cross. And on top of it is a Crusaders cross. This double cross let the Portuguese carrying on the Crusaders' mission and conviction, maybe by way of the sea to the Holy Land. And not to forget, in this part of my cross-cultural linguistic engagement with the Portuguese, everybody knew about Asia because the caravans had brought in from the Arab Peninsula. Columbus was inspired by the story of Marco Polo. With all the question of Marco Polo meeting Kublai Khan, of the grandson of Genghis Khan, and the dynasty of Yuan in the region of Asia, but the only story that's very solid was the Polo families, by carrying on an order from Kublai to present that to the Pope at that time. And there was a return trip from the Marco Polos, bringing back, along with them, the Kokachin is a princess from Rome to be married to the Kublais for the Mongolian Khanate in present-day Persia. However, that prince or the king will perish, but the young son eventually married to Kokachin. And by the return of the Polos back to Venice first and then to Rome, they presented the invite or the extension of the friendship to Rome, and the Rome subsequently also provided friars to return to China along with the Polos. But supposedly, either by part of the story, the movie that we just watched, Marco Polo, these monks never made it. It was a very, very difficult journey, even heading back around the deserts in the Central Asia and back to the Yuan dynasty, now a Chinese name by Yuan, but the Mongolian dynasty. So the story of Marco Polo had inspired, but the Polos had inspired Columbus, his own hypothesis. And also remember the time in the 1400s when the Ottoman Empire had taken over in Constantinople, and that had interrupted very profitable trade routes of the Venetians and also the people from Genoa or Genoveses. So all this Italian had migrated into Portugal, and with the port and the Portuguese exploration from Portugal to the Canary Islands, to the islands in the Madeiras, Azores, but beyond that, they were already in the African coast. Portuguese had got all the way to the part of Guinea. And remember, all the African countries with cities and country names in Portuguese. Cameroon, coming from the Portuguese word of shrimp. We call camarones in Spanish, camarão, camarões in Portuguese. And then Lagos, Nigeria, meaning lake, is also of Portuguese origin. And not until in 1492 and beyond, when Bartolomeu Dias and the Portuguese managed to turn from the Cape of Good Hope. That was the most challenging time. How did they go around the Horn of Africa to get to the east side of Africa? So you have first Columbus founding the Americas, and then the next movement was Vasco da Gama, because of Bartolomeu Dias turning of the Cape. Vasco da Gama, who had went on to East Africa, creating a base of exchange and learning from the Muslims, Islamic groups in that part of the island of Mozambique, where they had eventually gone on to the India, the coast of India. And also from other part of the story, there was a long time warship and battleship between the Islamic in the African coast and the Portuguese troops, all because the trade of spices. So eventually Vasco da Gama had gone on to India, and from India, I grew up in Macau, so we all know very well the colony of the Portuguese, and then we have a park called Luis Gamões, who was the leaders. It became a legendary history of Portugal made into poems. And that was the routing of Vasco da Gama into India, into eventual Asia. And in the 1500s, when Pedro Álvares Cabral took off from Portugal, supposed to be heading the direction into India following the routing of Vasco da Gama. And guess what? Accidentally. By me, it was never accidental. Pedro Álvares Cabral became the founder, landed into Portugal. Landed into Brazil. So this intriguing aspect of the exploration of the Portuguese and this dual competition of the huge kingdom of the Spanish Aragon and Castilla, plus their dispute with the Portuguese, and also getting all these navigators. All of them were schooled, taught, learned in the school of the navigation of Enrique de Infante in Sagres, southern part of Portugal, in the region of Algarve. The next one, the last one of the Portuguese navigator, as long way in this story, was the West known as Magellan. For us who speak Portuguese, we know his name is Fernando Magalhães, and he was eventually taken by the court of Spain. And if you will listen to all the stories about travel navigations and to use the Portuguese navigation specialist navigators and bring them to the court of Spain, and Magellan had the same hunch heading into the West, into the Americas, doing what the Portuguese done on the African coast. He was navigating down the coast of Brazil, South America, eventually passing through, today we know, the Strait of Magellan, moving from the southern part of Argentina today and get in through all the fjords on the islands, landed eventually to the sea. He named it Pacifica. Looks so peaceful. So the Pacific Ocean was created by Magellan, and eventually they ventured into the island of Guam, used to be called Isla de los Ladrones, island of the thieves. And eventually Magellan landed into the archipelago of the Philippines, and he was killed in one of the local battles. But his assistant, with 7 ships, managed to get back into Spain. But let me give you a little bit of the economic evaluation that I have, that most of people about history at that time not having a clear idea of economics. Of the 7 ships Magellan took off to the Americas and found his way into the Pacifics, Alcano, his assistant, also ethnic Portuguese, returning to Spain eventually. After years and after all the 7 ships, only 1 ship that came back to Spain, and carrying with them in the region called the Maluka, in the area of Indonesia, on the way back, they managed to have, now I grew up in Brazil, so when they talk about a weight measure called quintal, Quintal, it's quintais, plural, or quintal of cloth going through the Portuguese territory. Don't forget, when they were in the Philippines, the Portuguese already had gotten into Africa, East Africa, by way of Mozambique, traveled to India, and then the south coast of going into the eventually Macau, one of the earliest colonies in Japan, all that. But what is important that there was already very clear division line that Elcano did not want to travel back to the Pacifics and going through the Strait of Malacca. They hardly remember what they were. And because the line of the Tordesillas dividing the Portuguese in the east, namely Africa, Asia, and the Spanish had no business to cross the Tordesillas and returning to Portugal. However, be the current, be whatnot of the sets of circumstances, the Magellan's last crew by Elcano eventually returning back to Spain. But the subject matter is they only returned with one ship, and I lost count. You can do AI searching by Claude. I use DeepSeek. I use ChatGPT to get those articulation of the numbers. That one ship of cloves had paid for the entire fleet cost 10 times. This is where the commodities and the cost of the spices and the spice islands and the craze and the demand, the obsession first with the spice, eventually sugar, tobacco, and cocoa and whatnot. But that's the future story. But the Spanish had found a way, taking very high risk not to be caught by the Portuguese fleets. Eventually went back to Spain for one ship carrying X amount quintal. They returned the investment 10 times. 10 times of the 7 ships. So this is a lot of the incentives. The exploration is one, but by the exploration by the Portuguese started by the trade and exchange of the spice and other products from Asia into Europe, first by the Silk Road and then eventually by the ocean trade in the area of the Red Sea and the region of the Middle East, by the Arabian caravans to North Africa, so on and so forth. I want to put a little more time about this navigation of the Portuguese, because with the same intensity, also audacity of the Portuguese in their exploration of the Americas, and by my other account, the Portuguese were actually known about Brazil in the 1400s, not until 1492. That's why the king negotiated the expansion of the Tordesillas Treaty 370 leagues, meaning they grabbed a hold of the 3/4 of the continental size of Brazil. So the Portuguese had already the previous knowledge. And from the book I read from this Portuguese, Macarenhas Barreto, his book was basically telling me that Columbus was an 007 James Bond for Portugal, for the King John, because on the return of the Columbus trip from the Americas back to Spain, his first stop was not Sevilla in Spain. His first stop was into Lisbon, meeting with the king for 2 weeks. But all in all, history can be very entertaining, because the official scripture of history oftentimes are favoring the court or the dynasty that I have experienced looking for all the Chinese history. But sometimes a little bit off color, a little bit of the gossip. In Portuguese, we call it fofoca. A little bit of off the main track. Those stories will give you a larger linkage from the marriage arrangements of kings and queens, and for territorial, marrying their siblings off. Looks like most of the kings and whatnot, at least from Brazil, they have no choice of their mates, but just assignment, marrying into the Hungarian, Austro-Hungarian, the Habsburgs, and then eventually they have their love affairs and have other again, more gossipy stories of the kings and rulers. But in this incident, by what I'm trying to put the Portuguese story, maybe I'm making my presentation of the Consciencological Studies a little bit more flavorful. It's not as dry. In all these years, my cross-cultural experience had given me the living experience in Brazil for more than 50 years. I went there to Brazil when I was 14, 1962, left in 67 for colleges, then came to America, finished college, got my master's in 74. Then I took off, went back to Brazil. For the last 50 years. I've been engaged in the area of the gemstones and minerals. What that was basically a business, give me the economics self-sustenance. But on the other hand, it also provided me the time to conduct my interests of languages and of the people that I enjoyed the most. Brazil, got to go to the rural and remote regions like Rondônia, got to go to the area and city in São Gabriel de Cachoeira in the northern part of the Rio Negro River connecting Colombia, Venezuela, Brazil. And so making more inquiry and learning from the Yanomamis in that region and 30 other minority tribes, from Bare to the very connected in the region called Tucanos, and other connection I made into Rondônia, meeting the people, the tribal group called Cintas Largas, and a very small group minority called that are going extinguishing. So part of my business, and by looking for gems and minerals, exploration, exploring the opportunities, not just Brazil, it's taken me to come to the J mine, the only jadeite mines in Guatemala, into the city of Antigua, and then also all the exploration to gems, to minerals, including the strategic mineral. Today we're talking about the lithium. Before COVID, I was in the border with Argentina and Peru, and the border with Bolivia, in the area of Atacamas, where 10 of the seaports of Chile were open to us, to me, when I was exploring and hypothesizing what are the sea routes I can provide for the Chinese. Because in today's climate, we all know about the sensitivity about Panama, those are the chokeholds, and so is Malacca in the strait, very narrow, which is very strongly Western stronghold or American stronghold. And part of this knowledge are coming all together because my previous interest of the Portuguese navigation and the global ocean routes and the Silk Road. And today, the Silk Road is repeated by the Chinese, very much a great inspiration by Xi Jinping. In knowing our history, the 5,000 and more of the Silk Road were never intercepted in 2,000 years of history. And part of the reason, going back to the story of Marco Polo, was that the Kublai Khan wanted the Silk Road to continue because that was the area to connecting to Rome. And one time you hear about phrases, the silk is worth more the weight of gold in Rome, and so on and so forth. Again, everything I'm speaking in bits and pieces, sometimes not in the chronological order, but in a group, what I call the cultural sphere. By the Mongolian sphere, at wartime, when they have conquered most of the West and also created a Yuan dynasty in China, they did not want that trade route to stop, because directly or indirectly, all the gains from the economic trade of the trade route also benefits for all the candidates from Siberia all the way into Persia and into the western area of the entire Mongol Empire. And so I'm repeating of the trade routes, the part of my cross-cultural interest, curiosity, and where I have also created before COVID in 2016, I created a Portuguese-Spanish shared language named Casella. Casella means that Caminho de Seda, Seda is silk, S-E-D-A in Portuguese, S-I-E-D-A in Spanish. Caminho de Seda, LA is Latina America, which I have not followed the linguistic structure of the Latin Roman language, but using an English called Casella, Camino de Seda, LA. So Casella. And electronically, that's one of the idea I have shaped that into Casella, the future Silk Road between China and Latin America. Okay, today we look at the port of Chennai, and if the Panama Canal ever gets overheated, I have also explored the many possible cross ocean highway, you call it, between Atlantic and the Pacific. We have the option in Guatemala, $10 billion, which I work with the Guatemalan government. Just none of this were signed or paid by any government. The hypothesis of putting a Atlantic Pacific dry land road, but transporting cargoes over to one to another. Underneath it is the energy, petroleum, gas, or whatever. That can be done in Guatemala. That can be done in Nicaragua. In fact, Nicaragua was one of the first options before the European or American or French thought about Panama. And another option was Colombia. But this all depending on the quantity of trade in the Central America, south of Mexico, as we share. Mexico is opening another Atlantic Pacific Canal south of the Oaxaca area. But now China and Peru is having the Chennai and the cross Brazilian sections from the Porto Santos, Rio de Janeiro, from the east all the way up to the Peruvian port. Railroad system is going, and the south-north rail is reviving. There will be eventually more rails that are going into the coastal Chilean ports. But everything is possible. The logistics and all in what I have been thinking, also coming from my earlier thinking of the Portuguese, how they conjectured about knowing going to America, heading west, or get to the US. How did the Portuguese set up the Spanish in the use of Columbus to push the Spanish into the Americas, knowing there will be a land block? Why they're going south to the African coast, crossing over East Africa, and then went across to India, eventually China. But the focus at that point of the Portuguese navigation mainly was focusing on the spice trade in that part of the archipelago of Indonesia or the Philippines. And do not forget, the Spanish had the control of massive land and ocean by the line of Tordesillas in the middle Atlantics. They have controlled 3/4 almost of the US landmass, Mexico, and by what they have taken from Peru. And because the Incas, as another part of it, culture and history and civilization that we have not considered, be that from the west or from the east, the Incas already have their territorial control from the highlands of Machu Picchu all the way down to close to Patagonia. Not quite, but they were already occurring in Argentina today, Paraguay, Uruguay, and eventually there was the dispute and challenges and settlement of the same Tordesillas Treaty. So this is part of my references about myself. I'm amazed about the Portuguese navigation and their history and their poets. I came from the colony from 5 years old until 14. I basically, at that age, not so aware of the sets of circumstances of the culture of the Portuguese, that we follow the apparent, the adults, having certain kind of reservation about colonialism. But the more I have studied about the Portuguese history and their impressive navigation strategies and routes and executions, and also this year paying respect to, for me, regardless this Brazilian is Portuguese or me Chinese, is the Dom Pedro II, the last emperor of Brazil, who ruled Brazil for 60 years. And for me, he's one of the gentlest soul. And these three kings, Dom Pedro II, his father, Dom Pedro I, and King John, these three rulers of Brazil, by moving the entire monarch into Brazil, by not confronting the Napoleonic invasion because of Portuguese closeness with Great Britain at that time, these three kings, unlike any colonies in America, South America, or the US, they have installed one of the strongest, the most solid infrastructures, from music to theater to library to all the other implementation into the kingdom in Brazil, with the capital in Rio de Janeiro. So when I'm speaking of the Portuguese, I'm talking about the extension of the Portuguese Empire into Brazil. And Dom Pedro, by me, is one of the most respected, because these three kings, mostly Dom Pedro II, the last emperor, had his entire dedication, loved and care for Brazil. And Dom Pedro II was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and his great admiration of the French literature, music, and he's managed to have Brazil is the second country after the US, Alexander Graham Bell, to have telephone. Everything he did was for Brazil, including at the time when he had commented, he visited the US, which is a republic, not yet as a democracy, where he was an emperor, admiring all the advancement, even with all this Illuminati, the Masonic powers, were all the power that had created the separation from the sovereignty, from the kingship, from the absolute value of the monarchs. Dom Pedro II, I still like you said, Dom Pedro II, the second, had already embracing a quasi economic system, is coming into a republican, replacing the absolute monarchs in Portugal and Brazil, in this case is Brazil. And the only thing he held back, that he was not ready to move the parliamentarian procedures into becoming a republic. His major concern was that the Brazilian people needs to be better educated to share this republican value. Look at how profound his foresight. What has been holding him back is the public, the people have not yet been well educated. In the meantime, his trusted confidant, Teodoro de Fonseca, the military of Brazil, had coming into more excited about their own power because of the victory in the wars previously against Paraguay, was his best friend, and yet he was the one that forced out and giving Dom Pedro II 24 hours to leave Brazil. And Dom Pedro II and his family and his two daughters, the grandchildren, had not put up one fight without taking any possessions from Brazil, departed Rio in 24 hours in November in the year 1890. Slightly skipped me on this part. And his wife passed away, not making it to the Christmas in that same year. and eventually Don Pedro died 4 years later. But what I'm trying to say, in our human history, we've seen the absolute value, the king, the monarchs, the absolute power, and the England's parliamentary monarch, or what you call it, is evolving to give the power to the people, let the power, the best of the best, the elites, have the ascendancy to the power, for how long the power can benefit the rest of the citizens. Are we coming to an end of that corruption and decline in our quote unquote democracy today? Or was the American democracy has also been created at the expenses of the American foreign policy in this past 70 years? I'm just speaking about Monroe Doctrine. American had empowered all the military to repress any possible rise of the socialism or the fear of a communism. So a democracy has been sustained in the continent US while there's the expenditure of the repression and oppression of regimes, just because Monroe Doctrine, starting with the 1954, the Guatemalan coup, right? The United Fruit Company, with the assistance of the Dulles brothers, the creator of the CIA, the other one the State Department, and both were on the payroll of the United Fruit Company, with their power into Central America. The reason for the coup is because the president of Guatemala just wanted to help the workers, the banana workers, to have a slight increase on the daily wages. So what I'm talking about, the purpose behind my now promotion to alert my audience with the idea of Consciencological Studies, because I have recently discovered that for the last 3,000 years or 3,300 years in the Chinese history, with the value system advocated by Confucius, at the same time, there was Lao Tzu. We put him to as who has started Tao or Taoism. Well, that is the Chinese ecological order. Live with the nature, don't offend the nature's laws. It's an ecological conscience versus Confucius' human conscience. And at this very similar time, incoming the compassion of Buddha, which out of his own awakening to seeing the misery of the Indian people. The three concepts had kept a very good order of the Chinese. And also, I just want to add that I will continue to supplement by my presentations on a daily basis or weekly basis the Confucian value, where he had embraced and adapt and modify all the wonderful code of the Zhou dynasty. The Zhou dynasty had came on more than 500 years, even into the last part of the spring and autumn period, when there was the warring, because they had given so much land, so much giveaway to the lordships, kingdoms, or knighthood in the Western term. They have become rising up, become very territorial, to want to conquer one and the other. At the end, the 6 last kingdoms were taken by the first emperor of China, Chen Shihua. But I just want to remind the people a little bit about why Confucius have so embracing the code of ethics, the laws, and the order of the Zhou dynasty. Based on the latest cultural anthropological study of the Chinese today, the dynasty that had given the Chinese the oracle bones written format on all the shaman codes, prayers into animal bones and tortoise shells. The same dynasty called Shang also to have all of us know about commerce, because the Shang dynasty is written in the same character of commerce. And they have lasted close to 450 years of that dynasty. However, I want to emphasize the impact of the Confucian code is because the Shang dynasty and the rulers have the long practice of human sacrifice. More than that, they also practice cannibalism. Yes, the group of Zhou, of the Zhou dynasty, were also one of their subordinate tribes. The Zhou people were actually capturers or hunters of another tribe, or in the peripherals of the Shang dynasty, called the Jiang people. Phonetically, my Chinese have a little discrepancies because Jiang sounded like ginger in the phonetic sound, but I will provide more evidence on that. They were not sacrificed to the gods. They were also eaten in many occasions. They were consumed by the Shang rulers. And the founder of the Zhou dynasty were in prison and were forced to eat the dumplings made out of his own son. And these are the latest discovery of the events happened with the Shang dynasty. Don't forget, Shang dynasty is 3,300 years ago, who have provided the Chinese the written language and the characters development from the oracle bones. So in today's format, in this last structure or informal learning about us, about our culture, about history, when what Confucius had emphasized and what Chinese then in the Zhou dynasty had their suspicions in linkage with God. That's why Confucius has said frequently, respect all gods and demons, but keep your distance. I think these events of great extremism or great cruelty have allowed the Zhou dynasty to make themselves denying to repeat such cruelty, where they were part of the captors of slaves, and many might have also become part of the sacrifice or consumed, eaten by the people from the Shang dynasty. As a matter of fact, this linked me to another hypothesis of the American Native Americans and the originality. The theory from Bering Strait is one, which I tend to agree, because the ocean were much smaller, the land were much wider, shallower and hollower from China, from Asia, and also from America. So the crossing over from Bering Strait, be that of the Eskimo, the North American Indians, so on. But I have my question about the Middle America or Mesoamerica with the Olmecs, Aztecs, and the Mayans, and their human sacrifice based on this one thinking or hypothesis. Because when the Shang were defeated by the Zhou that formed the Zhou dynasty, the ambience where Confucius came from, when they were defeated, they were using their own slaves to fight the Zhou at the end of the big battle. It turned out to be a total, their own slaves turned their arms against the emperor. The last emperor of Shang eventually committed suicide. There was a document about the 240,000 of these Shang people had no accountability where they have gone. So I suspect, again, in hypothesis, is that this Shang Chinese, ethnic Shang Chinese, could have migrated by the ocean, came through the Americas, and that current have brought them into the area of the Mesoamerica. And some of the sea routings also basing on the ocean current and of the navigations of the time when the Spanish Empire ruled 3/4 of the world, when the Filipino trips had to go north to Japan, closer to China. And from Japan to China, in that region, the current bring them back to into the Oregon coast and eventually to Central America. Again, this is all hypothesis. But today, what is great is that no matter what I say, what I hypothesize, in the use of DeepSeek, in the use of ChatGPT, forget about the politics, in the use I use daily of the Anthropos, Claude, or Gemini, or now with Alibaba's Gwen, and now with Grok from Elon Musk. Forget about the political stance. I think nobody have a monopoly or to dominate a topic, not being able to defy or protest in ugly terms. But when we share these events, we can also start the procurement to try to find that evidence. How can I talk about the Spanish fleet, called the Manila galleons? If you Google Manila galleons, are the big ships of the Spanish that takes up to 800 people coming from the Manila's Chinese products to the Americas, traveling from the Philippines north and then coming through the current to Oregon coast, eventually down to the Middle America. And the human sacrifices of the rituals were practiced by these Mesoamericans. In the bits and pieces in Brazil, in the Tupi Guarani, Tupinambás, this recording of eating the enemies, one form of cannibalism, were also recorded. There was cannibalism in Papua New Guinea, Indochina, in the whole region. So now we all can looking for more data, more evidence. And this is what, in this segment, I'm talking about the Portuguese exploration, the Portuguese development of the founding America, founding India, founding Asia, had opened up my mind and given me more encouragement with my exploration of the subject matter called conscience. And I want to make it final, but it's not the end. Remember, 1492, the starting of the Spanish Inquisition. Actually, 1492, 100 years ago, the Spanish have given fair warning to their non-Hispanic Lusitania Portuguese, the warning about leaving the peninsula if they don't want to converting into Catholicism. And by this exploration for the 1492, marking the beginning of the brutal Inquisition, also started the exploration of the Americas that we know by Columbus. But from this reference point, also given me the exploration of the Portuguese other ventures into West African coast, and eventually they went across into an island in the middle of the Atlantic called Tristan da Cunha. What's very funny is that when I took my 14-year-old voyage from Hong Kong to Brazil, we stopped at this island in the middle of Atlantic after we're leaving Cape Town just to rescue 3 British scientists from the island called Tristan da Cunha. And there were evidence the Portuguese already using Tristan da Cunha is the travel point between West Africa and Brazil. And that's why the King of Portugal demanded the extra 370 sea leagues so they can get to today's, our beloved Portuguese-speaking Brazil. And I will continue to talk about the Western mindset have to explore the non-God basis and the subject matter of the human conscience. And also, that's not a methodology. Conscience existed from Jimmy the Cricket from Disney all the way to the Greek times. But conscience is so precious. I take the metaphor that we're looking for good healing herbs, and many herbs are camouflaged, are grown between all the greenery of this world. In here in Wisconsin, I've hunted for ginseng. The Chinese were looking the tastiest bud of tea in the cliffs, mountains, ravines, where often in the most remote region. The conscience of man, what I consider that is a self, is one of the precious things in us without the dependency of God and deity. I have nothing against religion. I get my learning or encouragement of my learning by the Roman Catholic Jesuits since the day of Macau, and I'm educated the basic foundations by the Order of Salesians, Salesianus, from Turin, Italy, the order of created by John Bosco or Giovanni Bosco in Italian. And my school where I have studied is halfway between Sao Paulo and Rio in the town called Lorena. That is where halfway between Rio de Janeiro to the city importance of Sao Paulo. The school was created by the order of Dom Pedro II of his daughter, Princessa Isabel, the Princess Isabel, to brought in the Salesians into Brazil. I'm very proud of the fact that I studied with the Salesians in Macau, and I studied along with the Salesians in Lorena, in the regions called Vale de Paraíba, is where the region has started the industry of coffee that had granted the Sao Paulo states become one of the strongest economic state. And also by the creation of the stations by the Jesuits, is the founding father in the part of Brazil in Sao Paulo by their schooling and by their church. And the Jesuit order had also one of the earliest creator of the language called Ninkatu, and we call it Língua Geral, or the Lingua Franca of the Brazilians at that time. During the time of the colonization of the Portuguese, they carried banners, explorers in Sao Paulo, we call it bandeirantes. However, by the other arrival of the Portuguese, there is a language spoken between the Portuguese and their mixed marriages with the native Brazilians. We call them Mamelucos. Their language is starting to become incomprehensible by the Portuguese just getting into Brazil. And what I found is fascinating by these Jesuits that had recognized a mixture of language, a hybrid of a language. And that's one of the reasons I went to the Amazons in 2008 and continue to see the remaining Ninkatu, they call it, okay, into the Amazons. And by the same token, I crediting this religious order by the Jesuits and their authenticity and how they have helped created the official language in Paraguay, which using Spanish and Guarani, one of the few indigenous language in South America that was preserved by these Jesuits. And some of you can learn about the Jesuits' influence by the movie was by called Mission. And this part of it is because I'm reflecting of the influence of Macau, where I got baptized by the Jesuits, by the order of Matteo Ricci, and how Matteo Ricci was one of the earliest Roman Catholic religious, spoke to Rome. These Chinese people do not need to be evangelized. And this is how one of the earliest Westerners recognizing the idea of a conscience, but they couldn't define. Not even Paulo Freire. Paulo Freire is hated by the rights and extreme rights of Brazil because his minor career with the administration of Erundina, and Paulo Freire was exiled in the early 60s to Chile, to eventually Switzerland and whatnot. And Paulo Freire's conscience idea of a conscientization had influenced or collaborated, not directly or indirectly, with the liberation theologians of Brazil. But we have to think of them not as a negative force. Be that Paulo Freire, be that of Karl Marx, dangerous works for the Monroe doctrinal practitioners. But these are the canaries in the minds that alerting us something is not right. I related my liking of Paulo Freire is when I was in the boarding school, in the Salesian school in Lorena, 1964, and I have seen and witnessed the tremendous people from the Northeast migrating to Sao Paulo, migrating to Rio, and created the greater favelas, the shantytown, where they have no provision, no government assistance. When I left Brazil, in my short 5 years in Brazil, I have lived at the tail end of the coffee growth, or the Época de Ouro, still very opulent time of Brazil, where I have no awareness of the conditions in the northeast of Brazil and the battles they had in Brazil in that segment, and the fight between Portuguese and the Holland, the Dutch, and how the Dutch slavery system have forced the creation of the quilombos, the black colonies, the escaped slaves, and the mingling with the indigenous white and others. I have no idea the battle of the Canudos, when one orderly religious man, not a monk, had created communities in Bahias. And yet was brutally destroyed by the government. I was lucky to come into a part in the period in Brazil when I have enjoyed the greatest cultural diversity in Sao Paulo, going into a club, swimming for a Jewish Copco Hebraica, where at the same table, the youngsters speaking to their children, first in Hungarian, Russian, German. Then came, I witnessed the incoming Sephardim Jews from Egypt when Nasser became into power. I danced with Moshe Dayan's daughter, Yaya Dayan, and sung the hymn of Avanakila. In my Chinese household, there were Cantonese, Mandarin, Shanghai, and occasionally my father's conversation with his French schoolmates from Sorbonne. One came from Thailand, the other one came from Burma. The Burmese uncle, his wife is French. We have the most diverse languages. I fell in love with the Persian rugs because the Lebanese, friends and pals, and the merchants in Sao Paulo. I had learned to love olives and eggplants of the Syrian Lebanese cooking. I value this diversity experience I have in those 5 years I have spent in Sao Paulo, from the Brazilian zone to the Chinese zones. And in and between the other Chinese, many were attending schools, the British school, the greatest school of Sao Paulo. Other went to the chapel, which is by the Franciscan order. Think about Felicians, almost like Salesians. Felician sisters started from Chicago. In and between us, yes, we have spoken Chinese, English, Portuguese, and that frequency, the free use of languages when learning curse words, cussing words in Hungarian, Portuguese, Spanish. What I'm trying to say in this particular search of mine about Chinese conscience, to comparison to the Western religious, what I had shown in my diagrams, that one of the major mistakes that Westerners have made, but again, mistake, ignorance is not a crime, it's not even a sin. When we're talking about the Chinese consciencological awareness versus the four or the three basic religions in the West, all were created under the cultural sphere I call the Abrahamic sphere. You have Judaism, you have Catholicism, you have Islamism. I'm purposely using Islamism, and you have later on the division of the Christian world. You have the Protestantism. By putting ISM behind this, the West had erroneously have done the same thing with Confucian's teaching as a Confucianism, with Taoism of Lao Tzu become Taoism, and last, Buddhism. Not until you can segregate this cultural sphere, Abrahamic sphere of the three Western religion and the off branches from Protestantism and the rest of the religious orders, and not just equate the Asian values, and in particular, the segment of the Zen teaching that is the real Chinese Buddhistic value with the elements of wisdom, converting the teaching of Buddhism interfaced with the Tao and with Confucius. And this is going to be a long exploration. And I welcome writing me by Gmail. If I have not listed, I will list it again. And I will also presenting this in my segments in Facebook called Conscientization. I think time for us to explore to have a better understanding of the East and West. Maybe that word of orientation will continue to make more sense, making more meaningful. Why do we have to explore the ideologies, concepts, and the wisdom from the East? Thank you for sharing.